And apologies for the delay. It's a lot of technology involved in, zooming in, playing out. So it's a bit more complex than just using Zoom. Welcome for the last panel for this day. After this, we will have the keynote lecture. But the topic of the panel is strategies for innovation through research. And it's a panel consistent of participants from academia and from industry to discuss what strategies and methods would need to be developed to effectively initiate, develop, and translate research into practice in the built environment. Can't you hear me? Okay, I start again? Yes. I'm happy to do that. Welcome. Oh, that's like, oh God. Welcome and apologies for the delay to people in the room and the online audience. It's a bit more complex nowadays with like live streaming in person, zooming in and so forth. So please stay with us and don't get annoyed. It's all good. We have enough time. The last session of today is for strategies for innovation through research. And it's a panel consisting of academics and people from industry to discuss what strategies and methods need to be developed to initiate and develop and translate research more effectively into practice in the built environment field. And it's my pleasure to welcome the conveners of the moderators of the panel, which is Associate Professor Ajibade Aibinu, who is quantity surveying and construction teaching here in architecture, building and planning, together with his colleagues, Dr. Mehran, Oraee, who is a lecturer in building information modeling, and Dr. Vidal Paton-Cole, who's lecturer in construction management. And we've got two guests online, which will join us in any second on the screen, I believe. First of all, Professor Rafael Sachs, who is professor at Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. And second, we have from Sydney, from UTS in Sydney, from the Faculty of Engineering and IT, FITE, Associate Professor Julie Jupp, and Associate Professor of Digital Engineering. Did I do that okay? Welcome. Oh no, where's the camera?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Julie. Thank you, Ajibade, for the invitation.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, once again for coming tonight. This panel discussion cannot come at a better time. The University of Melbourne recently announced the establishment of two new major investment funding. And first, there is a $15 million University of Melbourne Genesis Pre-Seed funding being established with the Breakthrough Victoria, and is to encourage early stage research ideas, new technologies, and to facilitate the university network in mentoring new research idea and taking them to the market. There is also the $100 million Teen Early funding as well, led by Tanara Capital, to invest in research idea and help them to get their innovation to the market. However, generally, in the built environment, the education sector is facing a kind of enormous challenges right now. And part of the problem is this: most of the research that we do and innovation in our industry, they often don't get to the market when we do this research. And that is, I mean, the factors responsible, quite a number of issues responsible for that, why innovation doesn't get to the market in our field. And so this is one of the things that we want to address in this panel discussion. We will also look at the issue of how this innovation get translated. Innovation developed in the university that cannot scale, that doesn't get to the industry, that doesn't get widely adopted, is actually a waste. So part of this we're going to look at as well. So tonight we have two speakers, like Roku said. We have joining us from the Technion Institute of Technology, Professor Rafael Sachs, who is a professor of civil engineering, and his research focus on building information modeling, lean construction, and synergies between these two areas. And he is the director of the National Building Research Institute at the Technion, as well as the head of the Virtual Construction Laboratory. And his research used BIM-enabled lean production control system, BIM technology, digital twin construction, etc. And he has published quite a number of papers as well, over 100 of them in various journals. He's going to be the first speaker for tonight. And the second panelist and the speaker is Dr. Associate Professor Jupp, who is Associate Professor in Digital Engineering at the University of Technology, Sydney. And Julie is working in the area of application of digital engineering processes and technologies in the building and infrastructure sectors. And tonight, we're going to have Rafael present first for 15 minutes. Thereafter, Julie will also present for 15 minutes. And then we're going to have a time of discussion. Now, I would like to invite Rafael to go first. Rafael, followed by Julie. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ajibade. It's my pleasure to join you this evening. I was a guest of University of Melbourne some years ago and enjoyed the visit very much. From research to innovation in the built environment. I guess the first thing I want to say is that path from research to innovation is not a smooth one, and it's quite accepted and expected that we should have many failures along the way. We can talk about this a little later, but I think that it's not so much waste as it is learning. And everything we do in these areas of research, many of it does not result in the final success, but we result in the failure from which we learn a great deal, on which eventually the successes are built. Next slide, please. Thank you. It's no secret, and we've just heard that there are huge new funds being made available for seed money for technology, innovation, and construction. I don't expect you to read all the text, but the message is there's a lot of money out there. And the next slide will tell us that, do we have the next slide? That not all that glitters is gold, of course. And then along with the successes, of course, we're witness to some rather sad failures in this space. Katerra's collapse in the United States was quite a major lesson for all of us in terms of the difficulty in scaling. Things like modular construction, use of BIM, lean production processes in plants, offsite construction, all the other wonderful and good technologies that we've come to learn should be applied, but that need to scale into existing construction systems much more slowly than we sometimes credit them for. So next slide, I want to, and perhaps we'll skip to the next as well for the sake of time. Can we skip to the next slide? Thank you. I guess our real challenge in embedding or thinking about innovations in construction technology is that we're aware of this notion of high-tech industry. And no more than us in Israel, we're sometimes called the startup nation. And much of our industry and focus goes around high-tech. But if you click once more on the slide, then of course we recognize that there is also a low-tech industry, and most manufacturing industries, other than motor manufacturing, other things that we can imagine, remain fairly low to middle tech. And yet if we click once more, then we can also imagine that there are some industries which have not yet begun to even begin the slow pace of uptake of any kinds of technology. And while this juxtaposition of these three images is perhaps too harsh and too severe, and certainly we're not a no-tech industry, but the question is, are we a single industry? And the difference is that we're very fragmented. And so there are very many types of construction sites. And it's only the most advanced that have any kinds of real technology on them. The vast majority of the construction industry, speaking of it as an industry, is fairly low tech. Next slide. And so it's into these areas that we have to innovate. And I want to start with an innovation that came out of our faculty, 2 undergraduate students who decided that we were spending too much time doing surveying in the field. They, during their summer surveying practice, were required to lay out points across the campus in the hot sun. It was close to 40 degrees. And they said, well, there must be a better way to do this, and came up with this idea of layout for survey using drones. One more click, and you'll see that if you can run the video. Oh, I'm not sure we can run the video. Yes, great. So their idea was very simply to have a drone which would be positioned by a differential GPS and would go along. They then crafted together with colleagues in mechanical engineering a system for inserting points in the ground. A QR code system allowed them to link that then to the internet and have it connected so that people could get the spikes. And they created a startup company around this. Now, here's the interesting thing. The company went through a number of changes and innovations. It began having sales in the United States. Next slide, please. But the interesting lesson that they learned through, oh, next slide. Sorry. Yes, the interesting lesson that they learned was that it was actually a lot more efficient to use a simple buggy robot. And they now have 2 kinds of products. As you can see, this one is run by a differential GPS and is very accurate to within 3 centimeters. And it can do hundreds of points far faster than any human group of layout people. And along the way, they changed the name of their company to be Civ Robotics. And the message is that this company did survive and is now thriving. They recently had a seed round where they raised a number of millions of dollars. And just a few days ago, they received a very much bigger investment from Trimble Navigation. And that really sets them on the path to very broad commercialization. Now there's a success story. Next slide, please. There's a success story which is in some sense of serendipity, but also it comes out of a culture within our country, university particularly, and our faculty of innovation. And it's perhaps that sort of thinking about methodology which I'd like to try to share with you this afternoon. So if I think of what I've been asked to present on of methodology for research with innovation potential, I think there are 3 key things I want to pick up on. The first is the idea, the basic idea. As you saw here, it has to be an idea whose time and place have arrived. And I will show you some that have not arrived, some bitter experiences. But an idea, it then has to be based on a foundation, foundation of theory and of knowledge and of information and of technology. And finally, we can talk about research practice. How do we go about compiling proposals, putting together work plans, and then bringing them to fruition, recognizing that it can all be messy and requires quite a bit of agility, for which researchers are meant to be able to do, but not necessarily does it always work out. Often our research funders are much less agile than we are. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the idea. And I want to start with the vision, and particularly the vision that has value and novelty. So next slide. What you're seeing here is a system workflow for digital design and construction, which was we proposed as part of the BIM to Twin European Union research project. The idea is that we have a digital twin of a construction project. On the right-hand side, we depict the physical twin, the actual construction project being built. And on the left-hand side, the digital twin, which has a number of different components. And the big idea here is that we can monitor what's being done on the construction site. We can, using various forms of AI and information processing, we can build up an accurate picture of what's being done on the construction site. We can then use that to learn about the process. We can feed that back into the planning and design processes and use that again to feed the next cycle of construction. This creates a cycle that we generally call the plan, do, check, act cycle in the notions of control or of lean construction. But there are a number of major differences here, mainly being that all of the monitoring should be automated. And that allows us to have computer readable information. We can then archive that for future learning, data mining, and pattern matching, machine learning. But we can also use it to drive decisions and intelligent decisions about the next cycles of production. And if we go to the next slide, the eventual idea might be that we could have control rooms. This is a control room of MACE in the UK. It's mostly done manually, but I want you to imagine for a moment that all the information was being collected technically through monitoring systems, and then people were able to make decisions about what should the next adaptations to the production system be. Do we need more crews? Do we need more equipment? Should we change things? What problems are occurring? And if we go to the next slide, then you will see that. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what this research essentially begins to say is, can we use digital twins for construction? But the part that goes to the vision says, well, maybe we can take that a little further. How well can algorithms make decisions or recommendations about future trajectories of construction systems? And it turns out they can do that very well and very quickly. And so then, if we can also achieve at some future point a thorough monitoring system, could we tie those together and have an automated system? And then if you click once more on the slide, we'll see that we can imagine digital twin construction as a new paradigm rather than using digital twins for construction. And it's that vision and ability to say, not where we want to be in 2 years' time or 5 years' time, and where might the industry be going in 10 or 15 years' time, that allows us to set ourselves or derive from that the short-term goals that we might be able to achieve with technology and with innovation, and that then require research. Next slide. So we can from that derive what the digital twin construction research challenges are. And you can see here that they branch to a range of different things. Complex event processing, for example, in order to derive information from the data. Information representation, how do we show that digital twin? How do we store it? And that leads us to property graphs and semantic web rather than the file-based systems that we have today. And then we have process challenges. How do we integrate the AI for interpreting the status of what's happening on a construction site? How do we shorten cycle times for PDCA control? Because short cycle times are critical to being able to do this effectively. In a sense, this is like saying, we'd like to go to the moon, but we need a wide range of technologies in order to get there. And we probably are going to have a lot of spin-offs that are actually useful down here on Earth. But if we just simply tackle the new challenges that we've posed for ourselves in order to reach that long-term digital twin construction roadmap. And this list, of course, goes on, and there are a few publications that try to break that down. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we realize that there are changing concepts in construction, and it's not only about the vision, but it's about the value and the things that we understand. And so Lean and BIM together, which are the key areas that I work in, really are changing the way that we think about these things. And they're putting emphasis on the information, on the products and the process, which would suggest that innovative technologies that deal with those information bases should be at the root of what we're doing. So if we go to the next slide, what we've tried to do is list out some of these previously unsolved challenges and to compile a list of some of the new challenges. And I'm going to wrap up this section on vision by saying these are some of the things that we believe are at the core of construction tech innovation going forward. And research in any of these areas, and of course it's very, very broad, should yield fruit that aids and improves the construction industry. Next slide. So the next section is the foundation. And briefly, I just want to pick up on the theoretical and technological foundations and the functional models. So next slide, and I'm afraid this will require a few clicks. Yeah, so one more. So at the base of this, we have design theory, information theory, and lean production theory. And a good grounding in early education is, of course, valuable in all of these three. As we go ahead, we see that the foundation of this house that we're building requires BIM. And BIM, of course, is technology, processes, and people in all of those different aspects. But the biggest enabler, the biggest game changer in the construction industry in terms of foundation for construction tech is these information technologies, and specifically BIM. And going on, we have the three columns. So we have construction tech columns, the technologies themselves. I'm thinking of things like drones that you saw before, but it could be a very wide variety of monitoring technologies, all sorts of other technologies. And then identifying short-term business process needs, how we want to change business processes, or how we fit into existing business processes and improve them. And then, of course, the column of entrepreneurship. And no construction tech comes to the market without a good dose of risk-taking, of entrepreneurship, there are a number of ways to say this, but fundamentally, enthusiasm, energy, and risk-taking. Going on one more, we'll see now the beam, which is the ideas, the investment, and the implementation. And these things, of course, the ideas come from the individuals, but investment and implementation require the support of the kinds of funds that Ajibade you mentioned earlier. And finally, you might achieve the adoption, which is the roof. And one more slide, one more click. And that really is what I might call the house of construction tech, which tries to pull together the different aspects and things that any of you engaged in research in this area will need to be conscious of, at least, and aware that all these things are on your radar as you put together a research proposal, define the methodology, and consider all of these different aspects. Let's go on. One more click. And the last of the three parts I want to pick up on here is that of research practice. And so, of course, we need to define our scope correctly, but we also need to balance ambition and risk and recognize that it can be messy. And when I say recognize it can be messy, of course, include the fact that we may learn something other than we thought we were going to learn through the research. We may learn that our innovation was useless. We may learn, on the other hand, that some other direction might be much, much better. And I think that as researchers, that's our bread and butter. And our research funders need to be aware that we are not starting out core university research in order to produce the next best, I don't know, cell phone, but we're doing it in order to create that house, to create those foundations and the learning and the knowledge that allows others then to go ahead and take the more successful ideas and bring them through into industry. And so in that context, I want to show you, and that's the final series of slides here. Next slide, please. The first one in terms of defining your scope. There is in the European Union and in many areas of innovation this idea of the technology readiness level, which talks about research, development, and deployment. And roughly speaking, we feel that the right scope for university researchers in engineering are more or less from 2 to 5, sometimes more. Many of the European Union projects go up to 6 and 7. And so we are required sometimes to partner with industry within our research projects as partners and go beyond that. But in terms of basic university research, these are the areas we should be in. The next slide and the series following that, I'm going to give you some examples of how perhaps messy it can be. So from construction tech, from research to startup, in 3 quick examples. So next slide. What this is Tamir, the Technion autonomous multi-purpose interior finishing robot. As you can see, this is from 1991. And the Technion developed, my mentor in my PhD, Professor Warszawski, and others, developed a robot. It was way before its time. While it could mechanically perform the operations, the amount of setup required for it was so huge that it was absolutely uneconomical. And if we go to the next slide, we can skip through some 20 9 years, roughly, almost 30 years going on for. And we have a company now called Ajibade. You can skip to the next slide, and if possible, run the video. And you'll see that what the Ajibade system does nowadays is it is able to scan a facade of a building, set up the robot. Although you're seeing an animation, these things now do exist in reality, and then to apply a rendering layer onto that surface. And perhaps the major difference is that the information technology, the information backbone that we talked about in the BIM technologies, is the game changer between 1991 and 2022, which allows these things to function. In the next slide, you'll see an image of crane monitoring from a company called Versatile, which is now very active in the United States. They've raised over $80 million now in seed money and are expanding rapidly. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that these ideas existed in research, in this case, 16 years ago, where we used a simple Liebherr tower crane, used the black box that was actually installed on that tower crane to extract that information and to build the basic principles for what now has become, as you see here, Versatile's crane monitoring system. And one more slide, and you'll see the kinds of learning that they're able to extract simply by monitoring the crane. That black box that you saw contains a great deal of technology which draws from it. And 2 more clicks, and you will see something else entirely. We dealt in the early 2000s, 2008, with the ideas of producing lean BIM production management software and controls for construction sites. This is a paper from 2009. And if you skip one more ahead, the basic idea was to take Kanban systems from lean, put them in a BIM context and create something called CanBIM. CanBIM was a research prototype you can see on the next slide, which actually we showed in Melbourne in 2012, 13. You see a slide from the mock-up system over here. And if I skip ahead, once again, through 2011, it was beginning to look still a research prototype in the laboratory. And in the next, the final set of 2 or 3 slides here, 2018, it's a company which is selling a solution in the market, but still learning a great deal. And nowadays, if we go one more, it's supporting construction in many, many sites across Europe, the United States, Middle East, and India. And the final example is the layout of interior works in building construction. Again, this is something which requires hours and hours and hours of manual labor on site. And so this depicts the kind of the problem. If we skip one ahead, then you'll see that around 2016, there were a number of solutions that had to do with augmented reality, with tablets and all sorts of things. These are valid solutions, but since then, the Dakri smart helmet company collapsed. Microsoft HoloLens is not very common on construction sites, as you know, although it's been around for some time and adopted by Trimble. But if you look one more slide, then you'll see that we thought about using another option, which was to simply project the BIM model onto the surface. And if I go ahead, you'll see the laboratory setup here in 2016. Simple projector setup with a laser scanner and a camera. Combine them all together, and you're able to do this kind of projection as a proof of concept, at least in the laboratory. This is TRL 345. And then colleagues set up a company called Lytix in the next slide. And you can see there that this is now being done in practice. They began with a very rough setup. And if you skip to the slide BIM to field projection, one more, then you will see that this now is a commercial product called the Beamer, and it is able to throw BIM models onto floor, wall, ceiling, and so on. So the very last slide, and I'll wrap up and say that we need to have basic ideas. We need to have a long-term vision. We need to have some kind of foundation about the theories and the technologies that guide us in everything that we do in construction tech innovation. And finally, we need to have a good idea of where our research practice is. And although the last examples were examples of things that really have gone on to become commercial products. They are offset by tens, if not hundreds, of other ideas and other experiments that have remained in the laboratory. And I'm going to stop there and let's hear Julie and then go to the discussion. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rafael. Now I'm going to invite Julie from Sydney for your presentation on the topic around strategies for adopting, implementing, and scaling innovation from both research organizations' perspective and from the industry perspective as well. Julie, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you to Rafael for all of those very interesting and valuable examples of construction innovation born from academic research. It's a good setup for this next presentation, which is really focused on understanding the two different perspectives on innovation. One which is sort of from that more commercial industry perspective. Innovation has really become a discipline in and of itself, and how that is manifest within an academic context, and some of the different tensions between that. So we'll talk about sort of the creation, adoption, and importantly focusing on scale and some of the pathways to scaling. I just want to start with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands UTS, our campus, currently stands. I'd also like to pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. So UTS. UTS has a big vision, and that is to be really a leading public university of technology that's recognised for its global impact. How impact is, of course, translated relative to the success of its innovation is, of course, spread across its many different research outcomes and how that research is translated. On traditional measures, UTS is doing, rather well. It's come from a fairly early history in transitioning from a technical college to a university. We're currently ranked 7th in excellence in research in Australia, 143rd in the world rankings on the Times Higher Education list, and we're a global 8th on the Global Young University Rankings list, and 15th for impact rankings. So we have very much focused on being a leading technical university and channeled much of our research and teaching efforts into innovations and to growing startups. How does that sort of manifest in our strategy, in our university strategy? How do we deliver excellent research that has impact? And here I sort of want to introduce this not as a model, but as a way to maybe introduce some provocations to set up our discussions. We, in our current strategy, really have a focus on our university processes, infrastructure and systems relative to outputs, inputs, outputs, knowledge exchange, research translation, outcomes and impact. And I think that traditionally how innovation has been managed within universities is that focus on knowledge exchange and research translation. Leveraging research characterizations that are, have distinctive strengths of any university and are supported by its core capabilities. Really need to, and there's no surprise that they're taking a very much a people-centric approach. They're focused very much on deliberately evolving an approach to research concentrations and more consciously driving knowledge exchange and research translation practices. Those research translation practices sort of are embedded across knowledge development, and there are different forms of engagement, of course, that we're all familiar with relative to sort of industry and academic partnership through incubation and acceleration programs, through industry sponsorship of higher degree research students, through knowledge co-creation projects. And of course, then you have different forms of research translation or research transfer through secondments, through partnerships, through executive training programs, CPD courses, and educating future workforces. And then, of course, you have the role of advocacy groups in the communication of those outcomes and impacts through steering groups, through expert panels, and through industry leadership. But all of this doesn't necessarily speak to a language of innovation that we see in industry, in commercial practices. Very much a university sort of centric approach is to focus on research translation, that are processes through which research discoveries and ideas, capabilities and resources deliver practical outcomes to those who are seeking solutions. What we need to do is really get ahead of that curve rather than focusing purely on a knowledge exchange approach, rather than a two-way exchange between researchers and research users to share ideas. It's about defining that future. Now, there are a number of different pathways that universities typically, and sorry, this slide hasn't really translated well in this platform, but there are a number of different pathways to impact through engagement. And one of those, which we'll focus on, because I'm aware we've only got 20 minutes left, is the commercialization of the new businesses and products. Currently we're seeing very much in the academic and university sector the evaluation of universities based on their knowledge exchange framework and their impact across a number of different performance indicators, how they're working with businesses, how they're working with the public and third sector, the skills, the enterprise and entrepreneurship aspects, local growth and regeneration, and IP and commercialization. We're therefore sort of going down the pathway of really focusing on some fundamental and key elements, but are perhaps distracting us in focusing too much on knowledge exchange. I'm just going to skip through these slides just so that we can get through into the commercial industry perspectives on innovation. So at UTS, we have a strong track record in the development of startups, both from emerging from research practices and also through our entrepreneurial programs that we have across business, engineering, and the architecture faculties. We've partnered with Startups Australia on a number of reports and investigations, one into construction tech and the status of construction technology that was sort of benchmarked back in 2017, 2018. Now from that, and during that time, we had a number of student projects, both seen from UTS and UNSW, as well as industry startups that were emerging at the time. Many of them, and many of the larger startups, for example, Lend-Lease's Design Make program, which was a timber based off-site manufacturing initiative, have not been able to scale and find their market, and have not just been impacted by COVID, but they have not been able to identify a market. And it's really that universities, together with industry, need to focus and concentrate their efforts in harnessing what we already know and can learn from in terms of how we translate and scale innovation. Colleagues at UTS have developed a framework, and I think that this framework is sort of relevant to understand in the focus that we see in academia on knowledge exchange, that we need to develop more capabilities in innovation management. And so there's this sort of nexus that we see between models of knowledge exchange, of innovation management, and of construction management. And of course, there are a number of different frameworks that we can call to and learn from with regard to these areas. Much of what we talk about when we talk about managing knowledge, innovation, and technologies is very much down to having a clear, and sorry, I'm not sure why, but there's a missing image there, having a taxonomy for for innovation. Your approach to innovation will very much determine your approach to risk, for example, your sort of ability to define the vision, the purpose, and the story. The meaning behind that innovation will depend on whether that's a radical innovation that looks to a horizon, or something that is much smaller and incremental based. And that then will therefore affect, of course, the supporting ecosystem, your approach to scale, and the building blocks that you then need to implement in terms of the talent, fostering of creativity and context. So here, this is John Cow's 10 Keys of Innovation. Now, John Cow is the chairman of the Institute for Large-Scale Innovation and has written a number of books. He's based in San Francisco, the sort of melting pot of startups. And I really like this particular framework, because I think that it touches on many of the things that we miss as academics in starting out to write our research proposals and think about what our end goal and outcomes and outputs will be. In sort of developing a vision, having that vivid and emotionally engaging and clear articulation of what that desired future state, whether that's a first, second, or third horizon future state, and how that establishes, that domain of innovation efforts. That purpose is then, defined relative to then that level of and type of innovation. Understanding your innovation taxonomy is really crucial for understanding the scope of your purpose. And then, of course, we've learnt a lot from the D School and design thinking, and the power and importance of story as a way of really releasing that vision and that purpose, how we translate that into compelling narratives. And that's key right from the outset in having meaning being driven through a project. It's important not just for writing research proposals, but of course, if you are developing an innovation that you're hoping to take to market and then eventually approach venture capitalists or ongoing funding, that capacity and ability to tell story, to have a story behind your project is key. So those building blocks then take on a more potent form, where the talent, the persons that have that special and often creative aptitude really adds that significant value, creativity, and the methods of working. Now, these are building blocks that I think that at universities we aren't particularly advanced at, in terms of being able to build a culture that is supportive of those values and norms that can maintain, attract and develop talent and creativity. Next, the context, the setting, whether they're physical or virtual, is really conducive to how we create, and the type of collaboration and productivity, and defining that within the research context and framework, mirroring that across into research, industry research partnerships. And then the management of that, coming and defining and developing what culture, leadership, and importantly execution looks like. Looking at the processes which the creative output is developed and then translated into value and results. And finally, learning. I think innovation sometimes fails spectacularly, and it's hard enough when that failure comes early during the sort of startup phase of that brilliant idea. But when that brilliant idea has passed that pilot stage and fails, it's that meaningful learning from those experiences that can then enable the acquisition of innovative capabilities and capacities within a university. I think that whilst we have pockets of that across the structures and research capabilities within various labs, it's not necessarily part of culture, leadership, or execution. It's not. There's not a continuous sort of feedback loop. This leads on to understanding scaling innovation, and there's a wonderful report that has been produced, Too Tough to Scale, and there's some really, I think, important lessons there for the construction technology researchers. Scaling really isn't an easy ride, even for those very experienced innovators. And the good news, however, is that there is a number of things that we can learn along the way from the established sort of domain of innovation management research. It's important to consider your choices relative to scaling innovation. And they're not mutually exclusive. We can go bigger, we can go wider, and we can go deeper. We can scale up and make the solution bigger and reach more of the market. We can scale out and we can reach a different sectors of people by extending geography. And we can scale deep, and we can build a platform around a core innovation. And importantly, these aren't mutually exclusive choices that we need to make, but they do result in a number of decisions that need to be made relative to a more sort of systems-based approach and how you develop the ecosystem. Again, returning to the idea of a taxonomy of innovation, a product innovation, and building the ecosystem around a product that may actually require a change in business model, a particular service, requires you to form complementary assets so as to be able to build that ecosystem. And so these are really the lessons, I think, that we can draw from industry within academia, that, importantly, scaling innovation is important to think about relative to timescales and strategy. It takes time, and so we're going to need a strategy for scaling. takes really complementary assets and systems thinking to, for adoption to occur in the market, and therefore you need to understand what that market is that you are entering. And so understanding really, I suppose, what affects and how we can help accelerate this towards scale is key. Timescales in scaling innovation remain stubbornly long, even though our current sort of construction technology life cycle might be getting shorter. So I think while it's going to take a while to move your innovation to scale, you're going to need to do much more than just sort of patch up and a kind of ad hoc approach to innovation relative to how the development of that strategy and having that long-term plan and how that's going to happen. I think that there's simply too many different bases to cover when scaling innovation, that you need to draw in a variety of technical complementary assets. The second aspect there around systems thinking is therefore quite crucial. Innovation and scaling innovation really needs the kind of systems thinking, identifying and then configuring the value and the value network, and the kind of additional players, the additional stakeholders that you'll need to make up that system, and then developing those relationships with those stakeholders, with those industry partners, is key. And so some of the things, around systems thinking that makes the difference between a really good idea and one that will have significant impact. And this is where we, as a sector, as a university sector, often fall short in being able to translate that due to a lack of sort of systems approach. I think that the third piece of the puzzle is another aspect that we see and can learn from industry perspectives, and that is really to do with the S-curve. And here we need to really look at the market and the demand side for our innovation, because unless really we understand our users and make decisions that are based on that need, the ability to scale adoption will be quite sort of short-lived. We also need to understand our users and getting them on board, and that is critical to scaling. People don't really simply accept changes, and we've seen that in the construction sector, in the very sort of slow initial uptake of BIM, and even still we see a resistance there. Instead, there's a pattern which I suppose, some are very enthusiastic early adopters, while others, may take a long time to make up their minds. And whether we're talking about new construction materials or we're talking about advanced construction technologies based on new model-based approaches to, for example, the development of and application of digital twin technology in construction or in operations, the same kinds of patterns will emerge from an S-curve, or in the form of the S-curve. Now, Everett Rogers really made his career understanding adoption and innovation. It was, his life's work, and he saw innovation and adoption in terms of a communication process that involves the inventor, the potential user, and the environment, and the inventor sending a message out about their invention. And he played with that model and the different ways to understand the impacts upon adoption by sort of tweaking different variables around those core three elements. You know, and his insights have given plenty for us to work with in terms of understanding that people will perceive your innovation differently, that perception and choice and influence are very powerful variables in being able to define and understand your market. And so it's how others perceive your innovation that really matters. Now, I suppose once you move beyond a pilot stage in the development of any innovation, we lose control somewhat of that innovation. We might still be able to influence it, and there may be some things that we can certainly take in hand. But as we've seen, sort of scaling really involves a very complex ecosystem that is dependent on a variety of factors, and is very situated and influenced by the relationships that we can foster with the stakeholders that surround that innovation. And so, its emergence, I suppose, is going to be a matter of co-evolution. And in speaking with many startups, it really is that initial testing and tweaking and pivoting, so as to be able to co-evolve with these sort of support of these sort of three critical areas of timescale and strategy, of systems thinking, and of understanding the market. At the end of the day, and I'll finish on this point, it's important to say, though, that we can't control everything. We certainly need to work hard to pick up, those early warning signs of ways of moving forward. And I think the same agile processes that we need to foster in developing an innovation certainly need to support an approach of scaling that innovation. So those skills that we learn right at the start, and that agile approach that underpins developing our idea, really should move forward as we then start to scale that innovation. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Julie, for that presentation. Now, we're going to go into a session of panel discussion, and I'll start by putting this question forward to our two speakers. The question is around partners in the industry, the market. So from what I can hear, we need to engage with the end users in developing the idea, understanding the problem, and as well as testing and iterating whatever solution is being developed within the university system. So the question I would like to ask Rafael and Julie is, often many researchers are interested in doing that, innovation. However, gaining access to that real world context where they can validate even the problem itself. I imagine a PhD student trying to develop a problem to their research, getting access to that real world context at every stage of the research is often a very big challenge. And so my question to you is that, in your view, how can researchers, PhD, early career, mid-career, gain better access to real-world context to be able to test the problem, test the idea, validate the solution, and even in terms of gaining access to real-world context to test those ideas out? How can we gain better access as researchers to real-world context?
Wow.
That's my question. Yep.
Well, That's a key thing, and I guess it goes down to personal experience. I do need to apologize and say that I will need to leave after this question. I'm afraid that it's middle of the day here, and I have a calendar of meetings lined up that I'm afraid I can't push off. But let me try and tackle this question, and then I will wish you all goodbye. I think that it's when we talk about engaging with industry or having the ability to talk with our end users or the end users of whatever innovation we're talking about, often those end users are either construction engineers, construction managers, site superintendents, or construction workers of various kinds and of various skills and trades. And there is the best way of doing this is a priori, meaning coming to the research against a background of personal experience in that industry. So I find that researchers within the lab, PhD students, master students, they're the ones who are most able, most quickly to understand the validity and the value of different innovations are those who've actually spent within their training a year, 2 years, perhaps 3 years in that industry, and whatever capacity that may have been. That may have been in design, where they were required every week or 2 weeks to visit construction sites, or in a construction management role. Now, of course, that's not a given for every research student, and not for every researcher for that matter. And so developing close relationships with people who are in those roles is a key way to do that. So that requires, and of course not with the whole industry, it just requires a few select companies or sites that you're able to build personal relationships. Having a forum of some kind of discussion within the laboratory over time might be a way to engage students with people outside. But I think that should never be overlooked. It's something that construction people right away have a sense of what can work and what can't work, and yet they may not have the vision from the technology or from the theoretical side. On the flip side is that research students and researchers do have the vision, they have the understanding, they have the stretch, but do they have a sense of what the real problems are day to day in construction? And those are not simply things that you can pick up a survey and design a few good questions and then ask people to fill in a survey. Those are very detached from people's real experience. So spend time, spend an internship for a month or two, dealing with people who are in the context and the environment that you want to develop your innovations for. So I would say hands-on experience of whatever form or you can obtain.
Thank you, Rafael. Julie, I'll quickly add this to that question. We are in an industry that is very risk averse. And so in terms of getting access to testing our idea, they're very risk averse, probably. They don't have interest because they've been doing things for 50 years and it's always worked. How do we tackle that, this culture within our industry?
Julie, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I really do apologize and I must leave for my next meeting. So I wish all well and very engaging discussion going forward and a great workshop today and tomorrow.
Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, Rafael. I think that needs to be taken relative to the context and size of organization. I think that different, if you're talking about different construction companies, they'll approach risk differently. We've done and looked at technology adoption in some of the large-scale Tier 1 construction companies that have been slow to adopt, and their approach to innovation has really been a risk-adverse one, and based on their business case and their particular strengths in construction, in being, in having a reputation that is not built on the use and application of BIM. And so theirs was a sort of really powerful story in, well, let's wait and see. and how they managed, risk. They didn't have a risk appetite for innovation of that kind. So I think, it depends on what the nature of innovation is. I think that certainly we're talking, about digital construction and digital technologies. It really comes down to the business model and the size of the organisation, as well as various factors then, in the supply chain and the type of projects. So I don't think that it's a sort of, something we can sort of necessarily generalise. I think that it will be very specific to an organisation. Just also picking up on the last question and adding to Rafael's response, I think that what we don't see enough of here in an Australian context in academia is really sort of long and meaningful engagement with industry outside of a research context. That we need to build, pathways for academics to, and not just early career researchers, so that they can have an understanding and a grounding in our industry. But it goes all the way up to a professorial level. But we need pathways to come back into industry, because I think that we have the situation where innovation is occurring so rapidly in industry. And the ability of academics to, I think, stay abreast of that innovation so as to be able to inform that. Of course, it's happening in pockets, and we have, just like we have in industry, champions of BIM and champions of change. We also need to foster that, link all throughout the academic's career, so as to be able to understand and communicate what is really happening on the ground.
Thank you. All right, why don't we take one or two questions from the room? Anyone like to ask specific questions to our panelists? Anyone like to ask any question? Anyone question? Otherwise, I would like to ask one more before we wrap up. And Julie, one other question I would like to ask you is around when you have, what can researchers do right from day one of their research? What should they think about in incorporating adoption, thinking ahead? I mean, kind of thinking ahead in terms of how that innovation will get adopted in the market. The scaling, can you incorporate scaling into the process itself?
Yes, I absolutely think you can. I think that you need to think about scaling from day one. And I think that this is something that we don't afford enough time and structure to be able to develop pathways to scale innovation. I think that quite often the research output, which might be a pilot of a particular new technology, is often seen that we need to test, and have a proof of concept before we think about whether that can scale. In having undertaken, PhD during, early 2000s, I was sort of exposed to the CRC for construction innovation and worked on a number of really interesting projects that are sort of really becoming realities in the construction sector today. Things like the automated code checking of Australian standards, things like digital twins for asset management, and these were sort of, fairly lengthy development projects undertaken in collaboration with the CSIRO. And, I was a PhD student and a very eager research assistant. And what you were sort of exposed to were those sort of very sort of technical, daily tasks. And it wasn't until the end of the project that you saw sort of then the commercialization aspects, which weren't really particularly well baked into the overall project, the overall umbrella CRC, as well as individual projects. So there were industry partners that innovation could potentially be sold onto. We're almost successful with the automated code checking project and having Bentley pick that up. But quite often, because the market, that S curve wasn't studied, the market wasn't ready, the market wasn't using model-based approaches, and there wasn't enough adopters there to warrant that technology development at that time. It was a really good idea, it was really successful, but the market study hadn't been done. So that time scale needs to be factored in when you start to think about your proposal. How blue sky is this? And what will happen in that interim period whilst the market sort of becomes ready to adopt that? And understanding the IP implications if you have a long-term investment with that, lodging patents, for example, not sort of letting go of the innovation, but keeping that innovation alive until the market is ready. There's many lessons that we can learn from the discipline of innovation. It's really changed in the last 5 years. Innovation management has really shifted its focus from creation and generation of ideas to management strategies and the kinds of supporting elements that we need to put in place so as to be considerate of risk, of time scale, of the ecology, and then of the market.
Thank you very much. All right, I will come to the end of this session. I would like to invite Rokus for the final word. Rokus?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for your insights, Julie and Ajibade, for the discussion. It was definitely in scale in terms of depth. So we went very much into the deep grounds. We're running a little bit late, but that's fine. We've got a longer break now. So at 6:30, I welcome you all to join us for the keynote lecture of today. The Robert Garland Tresidder Fellow, Jenny Wu, who arrived yesterday here from Los Angeles, and she will talk, or the title of her talk is Inlays, Loose Fits, and Other Puzzling Forms of Assembly. She is co-director of Euler-Wu Collaborative in Los Angeles and faculty member of Southern California Institute of Architecture, in short, SCI-Arc, which will be definitely an exciting lecture. So thanks for today. See you maybe tomorrow, or hopefully tomorrow, at Federation Square at the Edge, and see you later in the lecture. Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause to our speakers as well. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks,
Thank you.